The cabin stood with 4 stone towers rising like castle battlements through winter snow, smoke curling from each chimney while neighboring cabins shivered with single fires, burning desperately against the cold. What Lars Magnusson built in the summer of 1842 seemed like madness until the first blizzard proved that one fire traveling through stone could warm an entire home. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten frontier innovation move you, subscribe, because tomorrow's tale is just as remarkable. The morning of December 18, 1843, dawned clear and brutally cold across the Montana Territory. Temperatures had dropped to 20 degrees below zero during the night, and the air held that peculiar stillness that comes with extreme cold. Smoke rose in straight columns from cabins scattered across the valley floor, each household burning wood at a furious rate just to keep interior spaces marginally habitable. But one cabin stood different from all the others. 4 stone chimneys rose from its roof, each topped with castellated battlements that gave the structure the appearance of a miniature fortress. Smoke emerged from all 4 towers in thin, steady streams, far less dense than the thick clouds pouring from neighboring chimneys. Lars Magnusson stood outside his cabin in the pre-dawn darkness, his breath forming ice crystals in the air. He had been awake for an hour, and he had added only 3 logs to his fire during that time. Inside, his cabin maintained a temperature warm enough that he could walk barefoot across the floor without discomfort. In the cabins, visible across the snow-covered meadow, his neighbors were huddled near their fireplaces, burning wood as fast as they could split it, and still the cold penetrated every corner of their homes. Movement caught his attention. 3 figures were walking across the frozen field toward his cabin. Lars recognized them, even at a distance. Tobias Reinhardt led the group, accompanied by Silas Drummond and a younger settler named Henrik, whose last name Lars couldn't recall. They had come to see what everyone in the valley was talking about: the cabin with 4 chimneys that stayed warm while burning half the wood of a normal home. Tobias reached Lars first, his face red from cold despite the heavy fur coat he wore. He had been one of the loudest mockers when Lars began construction 16 months earlier. He had called the 4-chimney design wasteful, pointless, and the work of a man driven mad by grief. But Tobias wasn't mocking now. His expression held a mixture of curiosity and something that might have been grudging respect. "Magnusson," Tobias said, his voice tight from the cold. "My family is freezing. We burned through a week's worth of split wood in 3 days. My youngest daughter has a cough that won't stop." He paused, clearly struggling with what came next. "I need to understand what you've done here." Lars looked at the 3 men standing in the snow outside his warm cabin. Silas Drummond was stamping his feet, trying to keep blood flowing. Henrik kept glancing at the 4 stone towers rising from the roof as if trying to solve a puzzle through observation alone. These were men who had laughed at his construction, who had called his design a maze of stone that served no purpose. But winter had a way of separating functional innovation from foolish excess, and the evidence was literally rising in smoke from his 4 chimneys. "Come inside," Lars said simply. "I'll show you everything." The winter of 1841 had been Lars and Ingrid Magnusson's first full season in the Montana Territory. They had arrived in late summer of 1840, part of a small group of Norwegian immigrants seeking land and opportunity in the western wilderness. Lars had experience with carpentry from his years in Minnesota, and he built their cabin using methods common throughout the frontier. He selected a site near a creek, felled lodgepole pines for logs, and constructed a dwelling that measured 16 feet by 20 feet with a single room. The cabin followed standard frontier architecture. Logs were notched at corners and stacked horizontally. Gaps between logs were chinked with moss and mud mixed with grass for binding. The roof consisted of smaller poles covered with bark and sod. One door faced south. A single window covered with oiled paper provided minimal light. In the northeast corner, Lars built a stone fireplace using river rocks gathered from the creek bed. The fireplace was adequate, drawing smoke properly and providing heat when fed regularly. Ingrid had been 26 years old that first winter, 4 years younger than Lars. She had grown up in Bergen, Norway, where winters were cold but homes were built with thick walls and efficient heating. The Montana cabin was different. Heat from the fireplace radiated outward perhaps 8 feet before dissipating entirely. The far corners of the cabin remained perpetually cold. Frost formed on the interior walls during the coldest nights. The dirt floor conducted cold upward from the frozen ground beneath. Lars kept the fire burning constantly. He would wake twice during each night to add logs, maintaining enough heat to prevent the water bucket from freezing solid. But maintaining that fire required enormous amounts of wood. He spent hours each day cutting, splitting, and hauling fuel. By January, he had exhausted the deadfall within easy distance of the cabin and was cutting live trees, which burned less efficiently due to their moisture content. Ingrid never complained, but Lars watched her grow thinner as the winter progressed. She wore every piece of clothing she owned in layers. She stayed near the fireplace during waking hours, moving away only when necessary. At night, they slept under every blanket and hide they possessed, and still she shivered. Other families in the scattered settlement faced identical conditions. This was simply how frontier winters worked. You burned massive amounts of wood, you stayed close to the fire, and you endured until spring. By late February, Ingrid had developed a persistent cough. The cold had weakened her, and the constant exposure to temperature extremes as she moved between the warm fireplace area and the frozen corners of the cabin had taken its toll. Lars recognized the danger. He had seen pneumonia kill settlers before. He kept the fire burning hotter, using wood faster, trying to warm the entire cabin to a temperature that might help her recover. But the cabin's design worked against him. Heat rose straight up the chimney. The warm air near the fireplace never reached the sleeping platform where Ingrid lay wrapped in blankets, struggling to breathe. Ingrid Magnusson died on February 23, 1842, 3 weeks after her cough began. Lars had ridden 2 days to Fort Benton seeking medicine, but the post had nothing that could help. By the time he returned, she was too weak to sit up. The cold had invaded her lungs completely. She died in the early morning hours with Lars holding her hand near the fireplace that had failed to keep her warm enough to survive. Lars buried her on a hillside above the creek when the ground thawed enough to dig. Silas Drummond and Tobias Reinhardt helped with the grave, and a traveling Methodist circuit rider spoke words over the freshly turned earth. 6 other families from the scattered settlement attended. Everyone understood what had killed her. Cold and sickness were simply facts of frontier life. People died during winter. It was tragic, but not unusual. But Lars couldn't accept it as inevitable. During the days following Ingrid's burial, he sat in the cabin that had failed to protect her and felt something shift inside him. The grief was overwhelming, but beneath it grew something else: anger at his own helplessness. Frustration with the accepted wisdom that frontier cabins were supposed to be cold. A burning need to understand why keeping a home warm required such massive consumption of wood and still left people freezing in the corners. Other men in his position might have left the mountains, returned to civilization, or simply rebuilt their lives, accepting that winter claimed victims. Lars became obsessed instead. He started paying attention to heat in ways he never had before. He would stand near his fireplace and feel the warmth on his face, then walk 6 feet away and feel it vanish almost completely. He placed his hand on the logs near the fireplace and felt them warm. He touched logs 10 feet away and found them barely above freezing despite the fire burning constantly. He visited Tobias Reinhardt's cabin and observed the same pattern: intense heat near the fireplace, bitter cold everywhere else. He went to Silas Drummond's larger cabin and saw that even with 2 fireplaces, large portions of the interior remained frigid. Heat seemed to radiate outward only a short distance before disappearing entirely, rising up and escaping through the roof and chimney. Lars began asking questions that others found strange. Where does the heat go? Why doesn't it spread through the entire cabin? How do people in cities keep large buildings warm? Could heat be directed instead of simply released? Tobias told him he was thinking too much, that grief was making him fixate on problems that had no solutions. Silas suggested he find a new wife and stop dwelling on things that couldn't be changed. But Lars couldn't stop. The question consumed him through the early spring as he trapped beaver and prepared for the summer season. How could heat be distributed throughout a home instead of concentrating in one spot? The answer had to exist somewhere because heat followed physical laws, and physical laws could be understood and manipulated. Spring arrived in late March with warming temperatures and melting snow that turned the valley into a muddy expanse. Lars continued his trapping work, but his mind remained fixed on the problem of heat distribution. He started experimenting with his own fireplace, trying different arrangements of stones to see if he could direct warmth more efficiently. He built reflective surfaces behind the fire using flat rocks. He tried angling the firebox. He modified the chimney opening. Nothing created significant improvement. He began studying chimneys specifically. A chimney's purpose was to create draft that pulled smoke upward and out of the living space. But in doing so, it also pulled away all the heat. The hot air and smoke rose rapidly through the chimney and disappeared into the sky. Lars would stand outside and hold his hand above his chimney opening during cold mornings. The heat pouring out was intense. All that warmth was simply being thrown away. He thought about smoke and heat as related but separate things. Smoke needed to leave the cabin, or people would suffocate. But did the heat need to leave with it? What if smoke could be forced to travel a longer path before exiting, transferring its heat to stone or earth along the way? The idea seemed impossible at first. Smoke rose naturally. You couldn't make it travel horizontally or downward without it backing up into the living space. But the question wouldn't leave him alone. He started drawing diagrams in the dirt outside his cabin. Simple sketches of fireboxes connected to channels that ran horizontally before rising through chimneys. The drawings were crude, but they represented a concept that felt important. If smoke could be convinced to travel through stone passages before exiting, those passages would absorb heat. If those passages ran beneath the floor, that heat would radiate upward into the living space. In late April, a traveling stonemason named Willem Vanderberg stopped at Lars's cabin seeking a night's shelter. Willem was Dutch, perhaps 50 years old, with decades of experience building structures throughout Europe before immigrating to America. Over a dinner of venison and cornbread, Lars asked him about heating systems in European buildings. Willem described several approaches. Wealthy homes in Amsterdam used elaborate systems of iron stoves connected to brick channels. Some German castles had heated floors in certain rooms where warm air from furnaces traveled through passages before venting. Willem mentioned something called a hypocaust that Romans had used 2,000 years earlier, and he spoke of Korean homes that were built entirely around the concept of heated floors. Lars pressed for details. How did these systems work? How did you prevent smoke from backing up? How did you create enough draft to pull smoke through horizontal passages? Willem explained the principles of draft and thermodynamics as he understood them. Hot air rises because it's less dense than cold air. A tall chimney creates strong draft. Multiple chimneys could create even stronger pull. Willem Vanderberg stayed for 3 days at Lars's cabin, and those 3 days changed everything. The stonemason had worked on a restoration project in southern Germany years earlier, where the building featured an ancient heating system built into its foundation. Stone channels ran beneath the floors, carrying smoke from a central furnace through a maze of passages before venting through multiple chimneys. The system had been damaged and partially collapsed, but Willem had studied its construction while repairing it. He explained to Lars that the principle was simple in concept but complex in execution. A fire burned in a central chamber, often located below ground level. Hot smoke and gases rose naturally, but encountered horizontal passages that redirected them. The passages were built from stone with carefully mortared joints to prevent leakage. The channels sloped gradually upward, maintaining enough rise to sustain draft while forcing the smoke to travel long distances through stone that absorbed the heat. Multiple chimneys at different points provided exit routes for the smoke. The chimneys needed to be tall enough to create strong draft that would pull smoke through the entire system. If designed correctly, the hot smoke would heat the stone passages as it traveled, and those heated stones would radiate warmth upward through the floor above. A single fire could warm multiple rooms through this thermal mass effect. Lars listened with intensity that made Willem uncomfortable. He asked question after question. How wide should the channels be? How much slope was necessary? What type of stone worked best? How did you prevent cracks in the mortar? How tall did the chimneys need to be? Willem answered what he could, but he cautioned that he had only observed such a system, not built one himself. Lars spent hours after Willem departed sketching refined diagrams. He calculated dimensions based on his cabin size. He planned channel routes that would distribute heat evenly. He worked out chimney positions that would create optimal draft. The design taking shape in his mind was ambitious. 4 chimneys positioned at the corners of his cabin, stone channels running in a pattern beneath where his floor would be, a central furnace that would feed the entire system. The neighbors who saw his sketches thought he was planning a root cellar or some kind of storage system. Tobias Reinhardt asked about the drawings one afternoon in May. Lars explained he was designing a heating system based on European principles. Tobias laughed and said Europeans built with brick and hired skilled masons. A frontier trapper working alone with river rock couldn't replicate sophisticated systems that required master craftsmen. Silas Drummond was more direct in his skepticism. He told Lars that trying to make smoke travel horizontally through stone channels before venting was foolish. Smoke wanted to rise straight up. Fighting natural tendencies would result in a cabin filled with smoke and a builder who suffocated trying to prove a theory. Build a good fireplace with a straight chimney, Silas advised. That was all anyone needed. But Lars had moved beyond caring about skepticism. He had watched Ingrid die in a cabin that couldn't keep her warm. He had spent a winter burning massive amounts of wood while still freezing in the corners of his home. The conventional wisdom had failed, and he was done accepting it. June of 1842 brought warm weather and long daylight hours that Lars used for intensive preparation. He spent the first 2 weeks surveying his property and selecting a new cabin site. The location he chose was 40 yards from his existing cabin on slightly higher ground with excellent drainage. He marked the perimeter with stakes, measuring 16 feet by 24 feet, larger than his previous dwelling. The extra length would accommodate the channel system he was planning. He began gathering materials with obsessive care. River stones for the heating channels needed to be flat and uniform in size. He spent days wading in the creek, selecting stones that would stack properly and create smooth interior surfaces for smoke passage. He hauled these stones to his building site using a wooden sledge pulled by his mule. By the end of June, he had accumulated nearly 2 tons of carefully selected stone. For the chimney construction, he needed different stones. These required more mass and weight-bearing capability. He found a rocky outcrop 2 miles from his cabin where weathering had fractured granite into manageable pieces. He spent a week breaking loose suitable stones and transporting them. Each chimney would rise at least 12 feet above the roof line, requiring substantial material. Mortar was the next challenge. Standard frontier mortar consisted of clay mixed with water and straw. Lars needed something more durable that could withstand constant heat and thermal cycling. He experimented with different mixtures, combining clay from the creek bank with sand and lime he had purchased during a trip to Fort Benton. He tested samples by heating them in his fireplace, observing how they responded to extreme temperature. After numerous trials, he developed a mixture that remained intact and airtight when subjected to heat. Tobias Reinhardt visited during the material gathering phase and asked directly what Lars was building. Lars explained the 4-chimney heating system, describing how smoke would travel through stone channels beneath the floor before venting. Tobias listened with an expression that mixed concern and amusement. He asked how Lars expected to prevent the entire system from filling the cabin with smoke. Lars explained the principles of draft and thermal rise that Willem had described. Tobias shook his head slowly. He told Lars that grief could make a man do strange things, but building a cabin based on theories about smoke traveling through underground passages was beyond strange. It was dangerous. If the system failed, Lars would have wasted an entire summer's work and would face winter without adequate shelter. Tobias suggested abandoning the plan and building a standard cabin with a proven design. Lars thanked him for the concern but continued working. Silas Drummond offered similar warnings when he stopped by in early July. He pointed out that Lars was attempting something that required skills he didn't possess. Stonemasons trained for years to build complex systems. A self-taught trapper working alone was likely to create something that either didn't work or, worse, actively endangered him through smoke inhalation or structural collapse. Henrik, the young settler who often worked with Silas, was more direct. He called the four-chimney plan Magnusson's maze and said it looked like the foundation for a small castle, not a cabin. Construction began in mid-July when Lars started excavating. The heating channels would sit below floor level, requiring him to dig trenches throughout his building footprint. He mapped the channel pattern using stakes and string, creating a layout that would distribute heat evenly. The main channel would run down the cabin's center line. Secondary channels would branch off at intervals, creating a pattern that resembled a tree with the central furnace as the trunk. The excavation took 2 weeks. Lars dug carefully, maintaining consistent depth and following his planned routes precisely. Each trench was 18 inches deep and 12 inches wide. The bottom of each trench sloped gradually upward from the central furnace location toward the chimney exit points. The slope was gentle, rising only 1 inch for every 10 feet of horizontal distance, but it was critical for maintaining draft. Once the trenches were complete, Lars began laying the channel floors. He selected the flattest stones from his collection and set them in mortar, creating smooth bases for the passages. The stones overlapped slightly, and he filled all gaps with his lime-enhanced mortar mixture. Each section had to cure for 2 days before he continued, making the process slow but ensuring structural integrity. The channel walls came next. Lars built them up using carefully fitted stones, creating passages that were 8 inches wide and 10 inches tall internally. The dimensions were based on calculations he had worked out regarding smoke volume and flow rate. Too narrow, and the channels would create excessive resistance. Too wide, and the draft wouldn't be strong enough to pull smoke through the system. He mortared each stone carefully, smoothing the interior joints to minimize turbulence. Building the channels was exhausting work. Lars labored alone in the summer heat, mixing mortar, fitting stones, and checking measurements constantly. Each day he completed perhaps 6 feet of channel. The work required absolute precision because any error in slope or alignment could disrupt the draft pattern and cause the entire system to fail. By early August, he had completed the primary channel running the length of the cabin and 2 of the 4 secondary branches. The stonework was impressive even in its unfinished state. The channels formed a distinct pattern in the excavated foundation, looking like stone pathways or perhaps the walls of a buried maze. Neighbors who stopped to observe the construction struggled to understand what they were seeing. Tobias came by with his 2 older sons and spent an hour studying the channels. He asked how smoke was supposed to travel through such a complex path without simply backing up and filling the cabin. Lars explained that the 4 chimneys would create multiple draw points, and the gradual upward slope would maintain flow. Tobias remained unconvinced. He pointed out that Lars was building something nobody in the territory had ever attempted, based on second-hand descriptions of European systems he had never actually seen function. But Lars continued. He built the remaining secondary channels and then began constructing the covers. Each channel needed to be capped with flat stones that would support the weight of the floor above while containing the smoke below. The channel covers required Lars's most careful work. He selected stones that were large enough to span the 12-inch channel width with several inches of overlap on each side. Each cover stone was set in mortar on top of the channel walls, creating an enclosed passage. The joints between cover stones were critical. Any gap would allow smoke to leak into the living space above, making the cabin uninhabitable. Lars sealed every joint with multiple layers of mortar, smoothing it carefully and allowing each layer to cure before applying the next. He tested sections by burning damp grass in the channels and observing whether smoke escaped through any gaps. When he found leaks, he added more mortar and retested. The process was tedious, but the stakes were absolute. A heating system that leaked smoke was worse than no heating system at all. By late August, the channel network was complete and sealed. Lars had created a stone serpent beneath his cabin footprint, a branching pattern of passages that extended from a central chamber outward to 4 exit points. The system represented over 6 weeks of intensive labor, thousands of carefully placed stones, and hundreds of pounds of mortar. Now came the critical question of whether it would actually work. Before building further, Lars needed to test the draft. He constructed temporary chimneys at each of the 4 exit points, building them up 6 feet using loose stacked stones. Then he built a small fire in the central chamber where his furnace would eventually be located. He used dry pine that produced minimal smoke initially, waiting to see if the heat would begin pulling air through the system. For the first 20 minutes, nothing happened. Smoke pooled in the central chamber, and Lars began to fear that Silas and Tobias had been right. The channels might be too long or too complex. The draft might be insufficient to pull smoke horizontally through stone passages. But then he noticed smoke beginning to emerge from the temporary chimneys. First a wisp from the nearest one, then thin streams from the others. The system was working, though weakly. Lars added more fuel, building the fire hotter. The draft strengthened noticeably. Smoke began flowing through the channels with increasing vigor. He placed his hand over one of the temporary chimneys and felt strong upward pull. He walked to the farthest chimney, the one most distant from the fire, and felt similar draw. The 4 chimneys were working together, creating a combined draft effect that pulled smoke through the entire channel network. He let the fire burn for 3 hours, monitoring the system constantly. The stone channels grew warm to the touch. Heat was transferring from the smoke to the stone exactly as Willem had described. Lars placed his hand on the ground above different sections of the channel network. Even through several inches of soil, he could feel warmth radiating upward. The thermal mass effect was real. When he was satisfied with the basic function, Lars extinguished the fire and spent the next week refining the system. He adjusted the height of the temporary chimneys, discovering that taller structures created stronger draft. He sealed additional gaps he discovered during the burn test. September brought cooler weather and the need to complete the cabin before winter. Lars began constructing the walls using traditional log techniques. He selected straight lodgepole pines, stripped them of bark, and notched them at the corners. The wall construction was conventional because Lars saw no need to reinvent methods that worked adequately. His innovation was focused entirely on heating, not structural design. The walls went up quickly compared to the foundation work. But the chimney construction was where Lars's cabin departed dramatically from frontier norms. At each corner of the structure, he began building stone chimneys that would rise through the roof and extend 12 feet above it. Each chimney was positioned directly over one of the channel exit points he had created in the foundation. The alignment was critical. Any offset would disrupt the draft pattern. The chimneys were substantial structures. Lars built them with double-wall construction, using large stones on the exterior and smaller ones for the interior flue. The space between walls was filled with clay and small rocks, creating insulation that would preserve heat and protect the logs from fire. Each chimney measured 3 feet square at its base, tapering slightly as it rose. Neighbors began stopping by daily to observe the construction. 4 massive stone chimneys rising from a single small cabin looked absurd. Tobias brought his entire family to see what he called Magnusson's fortress. His children climbed on the growing chimneys while Tobias shook his head and commented that Lars had lost all sense of proportion. One chimney was standard. 2 chimneys might make sense for a large cabin with multiple rooms. 4 chimneys on a structure this size was wasteful and bizarre. Silas was less diplomatic. He told Lars directly that he was building a monument to his own stubbornness. The amount of stone and labor going into the chimneys exceeded what most settlers invested in entire cabins. Silas calculated that Lars had moved over 15 tons of stone and had spent more than 3 months on construction. A normal cabin could be built in less than a week. What Lars was creating might work or might be an elaborate failure, but either way, it was excessive. Henrik started calling it the maze chimney because the 4 towers rising from the roof created a confusing visual pattern that resembled castle fortifications. Other settlers adopted the term. They would say they were riding past the maze chimney, or they had seen smoke coming from Magnusson's maze. The name was partly mocking, partly bemused recognition that Lars had built something unprecedented in the territory. Lars ignored the commentary and continued working. By late September, all 4 chimneys had risen through the roof structure. He built the castellated tops last, creating battlements that served multiple functions. The raised edges prevented rain and snow from falling directly down the flues. The pattern created turbulence that improved draft by preventing wind from pushing down into the chimneys. The castellated tops of Lars's 4 chimneys became the most recognizable and most ridiculed feature of his construction. Each chimney terminated in a pattern of raised stone blocks separated by gaps, creating a profile that resembled medieval fortifications. Neighbors assumed the design was purely decorative, evidence that Lars had spent so much time building that he had lost sight of practical function. But every element served specific purposes rooted in physics and airflow. The battlements prevented downdrafts caused by wind striking the chimney tops. A simple open flue could have wind blow directly down into it during storms, reversing the draft and pushing smoke back into the cabin. The castellated pattern created turbulence at the chimney opening that disrupted downward airflow while allowing smoke to exit freely. Lars had learned this principle from observing church steeples and bell towers during his years in Minnesota. The raised blocks also prevented rain and snow from falling directly into the flues. Precipitation entering a chimney would run down the interior walls, potentially damaging mortar and creating moisture problems. The battlements forced rain to strike the raised blocks, where it would run off the exterior rather than falling into the flue opening. During heavy snow, the pattern prevented accumulation that could block the chimney entirely. Each battlement block was built with a slight outward slope that directed water away from the flue. Lars shaped each stone carefully and set them with his strongest mortar mixture. The castellations would face the full force of weather, and any structural weakness would lead to deterioration. He worked slowly, completing perhaps 2 feet of vertical height each day, allowing mortar to cure properly between courses. By early October, all 4 chimneys stood complete. They rose from the corners of the cabin like watchtowers, each topped with its distinctive battlemented crown. The visual effect was striking and completely unlike anything else in the Montana Territory. Lars's cabin looked less like a frontier dwelling and more like a small fortress designed to withstand siege. The maze chimney had become a landmark that travelers could see from miles away. Tobias Reinhardt rode past one afternoon and stopped to study the completed chimneys. He called up to Lars, who was working on the roof, and said the castle towers were impressive stonework, even if they served no practical purpose beyond displaying Lars's stubbornness. Tobias predicted that come winter, Lars would discover that 4 chimneys simply meant 4 times the heat escaping from his cabin. The elaborate stone maze would prove to be a monument to wasted effort. Silas Drummond was characteristically blunter. He told Lars that the battlements looked like something from a European castle, completely out of place on a Montana mountain cabin. Silas suggested that Lars had been alone too long and had let his imagination run wild. Building fortifications against enemy soldiers made sense in medieval times. Building them to vent smoke from a trapper's cabin was madness. Lars finished the roof and moved to the interior work. He laid a floor of split logs over the sealed stone channels, leaving a small air gap for heat circulation. On October 9, 1842, Lars prepared to test his completed system for the first time. The cabin was finished except for minor interior details. The walls were chinked and sealed. The roof was watertight, the floor was laid, the 4 chimneys stood ready. Everything depended on whether the heating system would function as designed or fill his cabin with smoke and prove all the skeptics correct. He built his furnace in the central chamber he had left open in the floor. The furnace was a stone firebox positioned directly above where all the channels converged. It was designed to burn hot and direct smoke downward into the channel system rather than allowing it to rise straight up. This was the most unconventional aspect of his design because it fought against smoke's natural tendency to rise. Lars started with a small fire using dry kindling and pine. He watched carefully as smoke began to fill the firebox. For the first few minutes, it pooled there without moving, exactly as he had feared. The channels remained cold, creating no draft. The tall chimneys above were producing no draw. He resisted the urge to open a door or window, knowing that cross-ventilation would disrupt whatever draft might develop. Then he saw smoke beginning to move. It didn't rise as it naturally wanted to. Instead, it began flowing horizontally into the channel entrance, pulled by the very slight draft created by the difference in air pressure between the cabin interior and the chimney tops. The movement was sluggish at first, but it was happening. Lars added more fuel, building the fire hotter. Heat increased the pressure differential, strengthening the draft. Within 20 minutes, smoke was flowing steadily through the channels. Lars moved outside and circled the cabin, checking each chimney. All 4 were producing smoke, though not equally. The 2 nearest chimneys were venting strongly. The farthest 2 showed weaker flow. The system was working, but not optimally. The draft balance needed adjustment. He spent the next 2 hours experimenting. He partially blocked the nearest chimneys using flat stones placed over sections of the battlement openings. This forced more smoke to travel through the longer channels to reach the distant chimneys. The adjustment worked. The flow equalized across all 4 exit points. Smoke was now traveling the full length of his channel network, heating the stone passages evenly. By afternoon, Lars could feel warmth radiating through his floor. He removed his boots and stood barefoot on the split logs. Heat rose through the wood from the stone channels below. The sensation was remarkable. His floor was warm throughout the cabin, not just near the fireplace. He walked from corner to corner, feeling consistent temperature everywhere. The system worked. Tobias and Silas arrived at sunset, drawn by the smoke emerging from all 4 chimneys. They had expected to find Lars sitting outside a smoke-filled cabin, defeated by his elaborate experiment. Instead, they found him standing in his doorway, barefoot despite the October cold, with a small fire burning in his central furnace. The initial success was encouraging but incomplete. Over the following 3 weeks, Lars discovered numerous problems that required modification. The system worked in principle, but achieving reliable, consistent performance demanded constant refinement. He approached each problem methodically, making one change at a time and observing results before attempting additional modifications. The first issue was uneven heating. The channels closest to the furnace became intensely hot, while those farthest away remained only moderately warm. This created temperature variations across the floor that defeated the purpose of distributed heating. Lars realized that the channel nearest the furnace was receiving most of the smoke flow because it offered the path of least resistance. He needed to force more smoke into the distant channels. He modified the furnace outlet, creating a baffle system using flat stones that directed smoke toward the longer channels preferentially. The physics was simple. By partially blocking the near channels and leaving the far channels fully open, he created pressure differences that equalized flow. The modification took 2 days to implement. He had to partially dismantle the furnace, add the baffles, and rebuild. But the result was immediate improvement in heat distribution. Draft strength varied with outside temperature and wind conditions. On calm, moderate days, the system worked perfectly. During cold, windy periods, the draft became too strong, pulling smoke through the channels so quickly that minimal heat transferred to the stone. On warm days with no wind, the draft weakened to the point where smoke backed up slightly into the cabin. Lars addressed this by adding dampers to each chimney. He fashioned metal plates from scrap iron obtained from Elias Corbett, the settlement's blacksmith. Each damper could be adjusted using a chain mechanism accessible from inside the cabin. By partially closing dampers during strong draft conditions, he slowed smoke flow and increased heat transfer. During weak draft periods, he opened dampers fully to maintain flow. The castellated chimney tops required modification. Lars discovered that certain wind directions created turbulence patterns that actually pushed smoke back down into the flues. He added small deflector stones at strategic points on the battlements, angling them to redirect wind flow. The modifications were subtle, sometimes involving moving a single stone by a few inches, but they made significant differences in draft consistency. Smoke leakage became apparent during the first week of operation. Several joints in the channel covers were not perfectly sealed. Thin wisps of smoke emerged from gaps in the floor, creating unpleasant conditions. Lars had to locate each leak, pull up the floorboards above it, add additional mortar to the channel covers, and relay the floor. He found and sealed 7 leaks during the adjustment period. The furnace itself needed redesign. His initial firebox was too large, making it difficult to maintain the concentrated heat necessary to create strong initial draft. He rebuilt it smaller and deeper, which increased flame temperature and improved smoke movement into the channels. By early November, Lars had completed his adjustments and the system was functioning reliably. The transformation was remarkable compared to his previous winter experience. He would wake each morning and add 3 or 4 logs to the central furnace. The fire burned steadily but not intensely, consuming far less wood than a standard fireplace required. Heat radiated upward through the entire floor, warming the cabin evenly from below. The temperature inside his cabin remained consistent regardless of which corner he occupied. There were no cold zones, no drafty areas where frost formed on interior walls. The stone channels beneath his floor had absorbed heat during the day and continued radiating it through the night, even as the fire burned down to coals. The thermal mass effect that Willem had described was working exactly as intended. Lars conducted informal measurements to quantify the improvement. He counted the logs he burned each day and compared the number to what he had burned the previous winter in his standard cabin. The difference was dramatic. His maze chimney system used approximately 1/3 the wood while maintaining superior warmth. Over the course of a winter, this represented savings of multiple cords of firewood and dozens of hours not spent cutting and splitting. The efficiency came from extracting heat that would normally escape unused up a chimney. In a standard fireplace, hot smoke rushed directly upward and vented into the atmosphere, carrying away most of the fire's thermal energy. Lars's system forced that smoke to travel through 60 feet of stone passages before exiting. The stone absorbed heat from the smoke, stored it in thermal mass, and radiated it gradually into the cabin. Very little heat was wasted. Neighbors noticed smoke coming from all 4 of Lars's chimneys and commented on the unusual sight. Tobias rode past one cold morning and observed that at least the maze was providing entertainment value, even if it was impractical. He assumed Lars was burning enormous amounts of wood to feed 4 chimneys simultaneously. The idea that one small fire was warming the entire cabin through underground stone channels seemed implausible. Silas stopped by in mid-November, and Lars invited him inside. Silas was skeptical until he felt the warm floor beneath his boots. He walked around the cabin, testing different areas, finding consistent temperature everywhere. He examined the central furnace and saw only a moderate fire burning, nothing like the roaring blazes most settlers maintained. Silas asked how it was possible to heat the entire space with so little fuel. Lars explained the system in detail. He showed Silas how smoke traveled through channels beneath the floor, heating stone that radiated warmth upward. He demonstrated the damper controls that regulated draft. He described how the 4 chimneys worked together to pull smoke through the system. Silas listened carefully but remained cautious. The system was working now, in moderate weather. The real test would come when temperatures dropped below zero and blizzards struck. Lars acknowledged this was true. October and early November had been relatively mild. He didn't know how the system would perform under extreme conditions, but he was confident in the physics. Stone held heat, draft pulled smoke. These principles wouldn't change when weather worsened. The first major winter storm arrived on December 2, 1842. Temperatures had been dropping steadily through late November, and the morning of the second dawned gray and ominous. By midday, snow was falling heavily. By evening, a full blizzard had developed with winds reaching 40 miles per hour and temperatures plummeting to 15 degrees below zero. The storm continued for 3 days without pause. Lars maintained his fire throughout the blizzard, adding wood every few hours to sustain consistent heat output. The wind created variable draft conditions that required constant damper adjustments. Strong gusts would increase draw so dramatically that smoke rushed through the channels too quickly. He would partially close dampers to slow the flow. When wind direction shifted, draft patterns changed, and he adjusted accordingly. Despite the challenging conditions, his cabin remained warm. The floor radiated heat steadily. The temperature inside stayed comfortable enough that Lars could work in his shirt sleeves. He walked barefoot on the warm floor and marveled at the contrast with his previous winter when he had worn every piece of clothing he owned and still shivered constantly. Outside, his neighbors were struggling. Tobias Reinhardt's cabin was barely habitable. He burned wood continuously, feeding his fireplace every hour day and night. The area immediately around the fireplace was tolerable, but the far corners of the cabin were freezing. His wife and children huddled near the flames, wrapped in blankets, unable to move away without immediate discomfort. His woodpile was depleting rapidly. If the winter continued with storms of this intensity, he would run out of fuel before spring. Silas Drummond fared slightly better because his cabin was smaller and better chinked, but he faced similar challenges. His single fireplace could not warm his entire space. Cold penetrated through the walls and floor. Ice formed on the interior surfaces during the night. He was burning through his wood supply at an unsustainable rate. When the blizzard finally cleared on December 5th, the temperature remained brutally cold. Lars ventured outside to clear snow from his door and check his chimneys. All 4 were functioning properly, venting thin streams of smoke. The snow around his cabin had melted in a circle, extending several feet from the foundation where heat was radiating through the floor and walls. His neighbors' cabins showed no such effect. Tobias arrived at Lars's cabin on the afternoon of December 6th. His face was haggard from 3 days of fighting to keep his family warm. He had come to ask questions he had previously dismissed as unnecessary. How much wood had Lars burned during the blizzard? How was his cabin so warm with such a small fire? Could the maze chimney system actually work better than conventional design? Lars invited him inside and showed him the reality. The cabin was warm throughout. The floor radiated consistent heat. The central furnace contained a moderate fire, nothing excessive. Lars had burned perhaps 12 logs during the entire 3-day storm. Tobias had burned more than 80 logs in the same period and had achieved far less comfort. Tobias stood silent for a long moment, feeling the warm floor beneath his boots, looking at the small fire that was somehow heating this entire space. His skepticism was dissolving in the face of undeniable physical evidence. On January 7, 1843, Tobias Reinhardt returned to Lars's cabin with his wife and 3 children. His youngest daughter had developed a severe cough similar to the one that had killed Ingrid. The child was 6 years old, and she was deteriorating rapidly in the freezing conditions of their standard cabin. Tobias's wife looked exhausted from weeks of trying to keep the family warm while managing a sick child. They had come to ask if Lars would help them build a heating system like his. Lars brought the family inside immediately. The warmth enveloped them as they entered. Tobias's daughter stopped shivering within minutes. His wife began to cry quietly, overwhelmed by the relief of genuine warmth after months of constant cold. The children spread out across the cabin, marveling that they could move freely without approaching a fireplace. This was how a home should feel in winter, not the frozen ordeal they had been enduring. Tobias apologized for his skepticism and mockery. He admitted he had been wrong to dismiss Lars's design as wasteful madness. He asked if Lars would be willing to share the construction techniques. He offered to pay whatever Lars considered fair, though he acknowledged he had limited funds. Most importantly, he asked if the system could be built quickly enough to help his daughter recover. Every day in their freezing cabin was dangerous for her. Lars refused payment and agreed to help immediately. But he was honest about the timeline. Building a complete maze chimney system required months of work under ideal conditions. In winter, with frozen ground and limited daylight, full construction was impossible. However, Lars proposed a compromise solution that could be implemented within weeks and would provide significant improvement over their current situation. He suggested building a simplified version of his system. Instead of 4 chimneys and an elaborate channel network, they could construct one chimney with a single heating channel that ran beneath the main living area of their cabin. The channel would be shorter and simpler, but would still capture heat that normally escaped up a chimney and redirect it into the floor. The improvement wouldn't match Lars's full system, but it would be substantial compared to a standard fireplace. Tobias agreed immediately. They began work the next day. The ground was frozen, making excavation difficult, but Lars showed Tobias how to build small fires in the areas they needed to dig, letting heat thaw the soil before removing it. The technique was slow but effective. They dug a trench 10 feet long and 18 inches deep, running from where the fireplace would be toward the opposite wall. The channel would force smoke to travel horizontally before rising through a chimney. Lars guided Tobias through the stone-laying process. They built the channel floor, walls, and cover using techniques Lars had developed. Lars emphasized the importance of airtight joints and proper slope to maintain draft. They worked together for 2 weeks, making steady progress despite difficult conditions. Tobias proved to be a capable mason once he understood the principles. His earlier carpentry experience translated well to stonework. They built a single substantial chimney at the channel exit point, constructing it 12 feet tall to create adequate draft. Lars showed Tobias how to add the castellated top that would prevent downdrafts and rain entry. By late January, Tobias Reinhardt's simplified heating system was complete and functional. The single channel beneath his cabin floor provided dramatically better heat distribution than his previous fireplace. His family's living conditions improved immediately. The cabin was warmer overall, and they were using noticeably less firewood. Most importantly, his daughter's cough began to improve as she spent her days in consistent warmth rather than alternating between fireplace heat and frozen corners. Word of Tobias's success spread through the scattered settlement quickly. When neighbors visited and felt the warm floor in a cabin they knew had been freezing weeks earlier, they asked questions. How was this possible? What had changed? Could they build similar systems? Tobias explained the heating channel concept and credited Lars with the design. He showed visitors the stone channel beneath his floor and described how it captured heat that would normally escape up the chimney. Silas Drummond came to examine Tobias's system in early February. He was impressed by the results and asked Lars directly whether a similar channel could be added to his existing cabin. Lars explained that retrofitting was possible, but more difficult than building the system during initial construction. They would need to dig beneath the existing floor, which meant tearing up floorboards and working in cramped conditions. Silas was undeterred. His woodpile was depleting faster than expected, and he needed a more efficient heating solution. Lars and Silas began work in mid-February. The retrofit was challenging as Lars had predicted. They removed floor sections, excavated carefully to avoid undermining the cabin's foundation logs, and built a heating channel that ran beneath half of Silas's living space. The work took 3 weeks because they could only work on small sections at a time without compromising the structure's integrity. But when complete, Silas's cabin showed the same improvements Tobias had experienced. Warmer floors, better heat distribution, reduced wood consumption. Spring arrived in late March with melting snow and warming temperatures. As weather improved, 3 more families approached, Lars asking for help building heating systems. Henrik, the young settler who had mocked the maize chimney, was first. He had spent the winter watching Lars, Tobias, and Silas stay warm while he burned through his wood supply and still froze. He wanted to build a new cabin with a proper heating system before the next winter. Lars agreed to help but made clear he couldn't build systems for everyone. He had his own trapping and farming work to attend to. Instead, he proposed teaching the principles so others could build their own systems. He spent April and May working with Henrik and 2 other families, guiding them through the construction process but requiring them to do the labor themselves. The technique was spreading organically through practical demonstration rather than theory. People saw functioning systems, felt the results, and wanted to replicate them. Lars shared his knowledge freely, offering advice on channel design, chimney height, and stone selection. He made no attempt to profit from his innovation or claim ownership of the design. His goal had been survival, not entrepreneurship. By June of 1843, 5 cabins in the settlement area featured some version of Lars's heating innovation. 3 had full multi-channel systems with multiple chimneys. 2 had simplified single-channel designs. Summer of 1843 brought travelers through the Montana Territory who noticed the unusual cabins with multiple stone chimneys rising from their roofs. A surveying party working for the territorial government stopped at the settlement in July and asked about the structures. They had never seen frontier cabins built with such elaborate stone work. Lars explained the heating system principles to the surveyors who documented the design in their reports as an example of frontier innovation. Word began spreading beyond the immediate area. Trappers passing through heard about Magnusson's maize chimney and stopped to see it. Some dismissed it as excessive effort for marginal improvement. Others recognized the value immediately, especially those who had lost partners or family members to winter cold. By autumn, settlers in regions 50 miles away were asking questions about the multi-chimney heating design and whether it actually worked as described. A fur trader named Marcus Stillwell visited Lars in September specifically to learn about the system. Stillwell operated a trading post 60 miles north and was planning to build a new structure. He wanted reliable heating that wouldn't require his staff to burn wood constantly throughout winter. Lars spent 2 days with Stillwell, explaining channel design, chimney placement, and draft management. Stillwell returned north with detailed sketches and began construction immediately. The name Magnusson method emerged organically through these conversations. People needed a way to refer to the heating system that differentiated it from standard fireplace construction. Some called it the maize chimney design. Others called it the channel heating system. But most commonly, it became known as the Magnusson method, named after the Norwegian trapper who had developed it after his wife died from winter cold. Lars never promoted the name or sought recognition. He answered questions when asked and helped those who wanted to learn. His motivation remained personal rather than ambitious. He had solved a problem that killed Ingrid and threatened to kill others. Sharing that solution seemed like basic human decency, not an accomplishment requiring credit or compensation. By 1845, an estimated 20 structures across the Montana and Wyoming territories featured heating systems based on Lars's design. The implementations varied significantly. Some builders created elaborate multi-channel networks with 4 or more chimneys. Others built simple single-channel systems that provided modest improvement over standard fireplaces. A few attempted innovations of their own, adding features or modifications they thought would improve performance. Not all of these experiments succeeded, but the basic principle of capturing chimney heat through stone channels proved robust across different implementations. The territorial newspaper in Fort Benton published an article in November 1845 describing frontier heating innovations. The article mentioned the Magnusson method as an example of practical engineering developed by settlers solving real survival problems. The piece noted that while the technique required substantial labor during construction, it provided significant long-term benefits in fuel efficiency and living comfort. Lars read the article when someone brought him a copy months later. He found the attention uncomfortable. He had built a better cabin to survive winters without repeating the tragedy that killed Ingrid. That others benefited from his work was satisfying, but he had no interest in fame or recognition. Winter of 1855 arrived with the usual Montana severity. Lars Magnusson was 48 years old now, weathered by years of frontier life, but healthy and content. He had remarried in 1847 to a widow named Karin, who had lost her husband to a logging accident. They had 3 children together, 2 daughters and a son, who ranged in age from 7 to 3. The cabin Lars had built 13 years earlier remained their home, solid and warm as the day he completed it. On a clear December morning, Lars walked to the hillside where Ingrid was buried. He made this journey several times each year, maintaining the stone cairn that marked her grave and spending time in quiet reflection. The hillside was covered in deep snow, but Lars walked easily despite the cold. His boots were warm because his feet were warm. Even outdoors, heat seemed to radiate from him, residual warmth absorbed from the floors he walked on daily. He stood at Ingrid's grave and noticed something remarkable. The snow around his feet was melting, creating a small circle of bare ground where he stood. Heat from his body, warmth he had absorbed from his cabin's radiant floors, was sufficient to melt snow even in the open air. The observation was trivial, but symbolically powerful. The heating system he had built in response to her death was so effective that its warmth literally traveled with him beyond his cabin walls. Lars thought about the 13 winters since her death. He had survived them all in comfort his neighbors once considered impossible. His children were growing up in a home where winter meant warmth and security rather than suffering and danger. Karin had never experienced the constant cold that weakened Ingrid. The innovation born from tragedy had protected dozens of families across the territory from similar fates. He knew that his cabin would outlast him. The stone channels beneath the floor were built to endure for generations. The 4 chimneys rising from the roof would stand for decades. Future inhabitants would benefit from the work he had done in the summer of 1842, perhaps never knowing the name of the Norwegian trapper who built it or the grief that motivated his obsession with heating. That anonymity felt appropriate to Lars. He had never wanted recognition. He had wanted Ingrid to live, and when that became impossible, he had wanted to prevent others from dying the same way. The maze chimney accomplished that goal. Settlers building new cabins across Montana and Wyoming were incorporating heating channels into their designs. The innovation was becoming standard practice rather than experimental technique. Lars touched the cold stones of Ingrid's cairn and spoke quietly to her as he sometimes did. He told her that her death had not been meaningless, that the warmth she never experienced was now protecting children across the territory. He stayed until the small circle of melted snow around his feet had grown to nearly 2 feet in diameter, heat radiating from his body into the frozen ground. Then he walked back down the hillside toward his cabin, where smoke rose in thin streams from 4 stone chimneys standing like sentinels against the winter sky. The maze that neighbors had mocked now warmed his family and dozens of others. The impossible had become routine, carved not in monuments or written in books, but built into stone channels beneath cabin floors across the frontier.